Now, back in May of this year, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge finally opened in Disneyland, which is essentially a 13-acre attraction that recreates or brings to life a part of the actual Star Wars galaxy, that being Black Spire Outpost on the planet Batuu. And if you're a Star Wars fan and that name doesn't immediately ring a bell, like perhaps Mos Eisley on Tatooine would, that's because it's actually a brand new location, one never before seen in Star Wars anywhere, until of course some books and comics featuring it started to come out in the past few months, publications that will only be seen and read by a small portion of the fanbase who care about those sort of things. Though it won't surprise me if the new planet or the outpost gets mentioned or even briefly seen in the upcoming Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Which would make sense because that's the time period the park, which is considered part of the canon or larger overall story of Star Wars, is set in. It's set in the time period of the sequel trilogy, and you can even see and interact with characters like Kylo Ren or Rey from the newest films. Not characters like, Darth Vader, for example, arguably one of the most iconic and recognizable characters in the history of film. Anyway, the opening of Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland was hailed as the biggest attraction opening ever in the history of the park. So big that special rules were initially put in place about who could enter it, how long they could stay, and so on. So big and such a surefire hit, one that, of course, every Star Wars fan was just waiting to see, that they didn't even bother to advertise it, at least at first, because they've now started to do just that, with billboards, commercials, and the like. And the reason for that is because overall attendance at Disneyland and profits are actually down since the opening of Galaxy's Edge. Which brings us to a series of interesting questions. Questions that, depending on your point of view or feelings towards Disney Star Wars, will likely heavily influence what you think the answers are or what the conclusion should be. Because if you've been loving it, you no doubt point at the low attendance at Galaxy's Edge and maybe other issues with the franchise, like the low box office performance of Solo, and say that at the worst, Star Wars is just experiencing a few minor setbacks or a few small speed bumps along the way. And that, as Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, said, one of the main reasons for the drop in attendance at Disneyland after the opening of Galaxy's Edge is that it was such a huge opening, and that it scared people away because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to enjoy an overcrowded park. And honestly, I'm sure that has kept at least some people away. But if you haven't been a fan of Disney Star Wars, you'll see this as just more proof or evidence that the sky is falling and Star Wars is dying a slow death, and that nobody likes the sequel trilogy, and that it was a big mistake to base Galaxy's Edge around it, that if they were to set it in the original trilogy or prequel trilogy, or maybe featured a mix of different time periods, more people would show up, which, yeah, is probably true to some extent too. And no matter how you feel about Disney Star Wars right now, I do think it's a fair question to ask whether or not it was a mistake to bet so big on the sequel trilogy, to create an entire park centered around a time period and characters that, turns out, many fans haven't exactly enjoyed, and that, so it seems right now at least, will not end up being anywhere near as iconic as other characters from other time periods. And before you take to the comments and say that you've actually been to Galaxy's Edge and that it's awesome and a great experience and all Star Wars fans should check it out, I'm not really here to argue how good or bad it is. I'm sure it's probably pretty damn awesome when you're there and for what it is. The question is, which sounds more appealing to fans today? Something set in the sequel trilogy era with new characters, or something set in the original trilogy era with legacy characters? And yes, I did purposely ask which sounds more appealing today, because in time, what people want out of a Star Wars land could potentially change, which is likely what Disney is banking on long term here. That if given enough time, the characters of the sequel trilogy will become icons of Star Wars that everyone flocks to see. But to that belief, I would ask, what characters became real icons from the prequel trilogy? And I'm not talking about within the core fanbase, I'm talking about just in general, or with people who might not consider themselves true Star Wars fans per se, but still like or enjoy Star Wars nonetheless. Because when you go into a random store and see Star Wars merchandise of some type, you rarely actually see anything from the prequels. And sure, you see some stuff here and there, no doubt about it, but it's predominantly original trilogy and sequel trilogy merchandise that you'll find. And that's because the prequels were not the cultural phenomena that the original trilogy was, not even close. And relax, prequel fans, that's not really meant to be a knock on the prequels, which I do personally love and really enjoy. It's just a reality of things, that those movies didn't have anywhere near the same impact overall that the original trilogy did with the average person of the time. Most non-Star Wars fans are rather indifferent towards the prequels, or have maybe come to the conclusion or been brought to the popular belief, true or not, that they were bad or just inferior to the originals. The common held belief outside the fandom seems to be that they just weren't as good. That said, though, I do still think the prequels had a large impact on the younger generation of the time, something I'll talk more about in a bit. But the simple truth here is that virtually none of the characters from the prequels, or should I say none that originated in them, are as recognizable or iconic or as marketable as those in the original trilogy. Yoda, Vader, Luke, Han, Leia, Chewie, R2, 3PO. Those characters have long since transcended the fandom and become pop culture legends that will always sell and always be the characters most people just associate with Star Wars. I mean, if you ask the average person on the street to name a Star Wars character, it's likely one of those names that you're going to get. And generally, you won't hear names like Anakin, Darth Maul, or Padme, nor will you likely even hear names like Rey, Kylo Ren, or any of the other new characters either. Again, those classic characters are just synonymous with Star Wars. They're the first thing people think of when they hear those words. However, that's probably something Disney wants to change, and though I don't think they have some devious plan or intent on destroying the original trilogy time period and its characters, after all, there's still money to be made from them, I don't think they want them to be the characters everyone immediately thinks of when they hear the words Star Wars. As I've said many times before, they likely want to make Star Wars their own. They want to build the future of the franchise off the characters they create. And with Galaxy's Edge, you could say they've literally tried to do that. And do keep in mind the idea to base the park off the sequel trilogy, or the decision, was made before The Force Awakens ever even came out. And so my answer then to anyone who asks how Disney could be so stupid as to make a land based solely on the controversial sequel trilogy and not the original trilogy would be to first remind them when exactly that decision was made, and that the idea or hope behind it was that in 10, 20, or however many years from now, these characters and this time period would be what people thought of when they heard the words Star Wars. That the sequel trilogy would have been a huge, massive success on every possible front that started out a whole new era of Star Wars with a giant bang, and that everyone would be on the train that just kept on rolling. But for that to happen, for a true changing of the guard to begin, a few very important things needed to occur. First, longtime fans from either the prequels and or original trilogy era needed to fully embrace this new trilogy and the new characters. Second, you needed to hook the average person or very casual fan. A lot of people went to The Force Awakens just because it was the return of Star Wars, and it was the thing everyone was doing. Even after the prequels had, as I talked about before, maybe tarnished the name of Star Wars a bit in the eyes of the average moviegoer, there was still a reverence of sorts around the original trilogy. Again, the time period most think of when they hear Star Wars. Finally, the kids of this new generation needed to fall in love with the sequel trilogy so that they'd be taking their own kids to Galaxy's Edge a couple decades down the road. This is likely the ultimate plan behind Disney Star Wars, to turn this new generation into fans of their version of Star Wars. And this is where the true debate or discussion really begins, about how well Disney has achieved these goals thus far. And again, what side you fall upon will of course influence your view. Whether or not you like or dislike Disney Star Wars will color your vision one way or the other. And look, I know a lot of people think I'm 100% anti-Disney Star Wars or something. I'm always accused of just being a hater, despite the fact that the only thing I really haven't enjoyed from them at all is The Last Jedi. As I've said many times before, I'm fine with The Force Awakens, and I think it's great for what it is, a reintroduction to Star Wars for those who needed it. And I actually really love Rogue One and enjoy Solo quite a bit. I thought Rebels was a great show and even terrific at times, but not quite as good as the Clone Wars overall. The other sources of canon, like the books and comics, have been hit and miss, with my biggest complaint being that a lot of the time it just feels like unnecessary filler instead of good, relevant stories. In other words, outside of The Last Jedi or excluding it, I give Disney a solid B-. No, they haven't done anywhere near as well as they easily could have or would have done with better planning from the start, but I don't think it's been terrible, and there's been quite a bit I've enjoyed. So please keep in mind for the rest of this video that I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who has enjoyed some of Disney Star Wars, and who wants to see it get even better and to succeed in the future. Okay, so what's the real problem with Star Wars right now? And before you say there isn't one, I'd ask why Bob Iger announced a slowdown for the franchise. I'd ask how you can blame Star Wars fatigue on the failure of Solo at the box office, like he basically did. How you can argue people think there's too many Star Wars movies after getting 4 of them in the past few years, while Marvel has put out 23 movies in 11 years, and when the last 6 of them which have come out in a mere 18-month time span, have grossed over $9 billion worldwide combined. So even if you want to say there's nothing wrong with Star Wars or that it's doing fine, then let's ask the question why what many consider or considered the biggest franchise in the history of the world is getting crushed by Marvel right now and can't even sustain one movie a year according to the CEO of Disney. Well, starting with the core fan base here, I think Disney and Lucasfilm didn't fully grasp what many of them were looking forward to the most in the new trilogy, which was getting to see the old characters again. That's what they thought they were signing up for, a trilogy that was going to be a direct continuation of the old story and the characters from it, a story some had waited over 30 years for. Whereas Disney saw this new trilogy as a sort of soft reboot of the franchise, and they looked at the old characters as a means by which to highlight and push their new characters. They'd get people in the theater with the old and keep them coming back for more by getting them interested in the new, which is actually a solid game plan as long as you're careful to honor the old characters and give them their dues, and to make sure the new characters are truly worth getting interested in and following in the eventual absence of those old characters. In other words, this was as simple as giving the old characters a fitting end and creating interesting stories for the new ones. Do that, and the sequel trilogy would have been a slam dunk success with nearly everyone. Problem is, a lot of people really didn't like the new characters so much, nor were they oblivious to the fact that the old ones seemed to be used merely as a stepping stone to something new and different, that they were being pushed aside to make way for a whole new era of the franchise. And so, to many fans, the sequel trilogy feels too much like a path to the future of Star Wars, instead of any sort of monument to the old. Though that's not to say that absolutely nobody enjoys the sequel trilogy. Plenty of people do. Plenty of hardcore fans love it, in fact. And not everyone has an issue with the way the old characters were handled. Some even found it refreshing that they didn't go the predictable route with a character like Luke. Though the interesting question is, how many would have truly been upset if they had gone the predictable route with Luke? How many would have been adamantly upset and voicing their dismay for months on end after the movie if Luke had just been more or less what we expected, a Jedi Grandmaster who had never given up? And if maybe Han and Leia had, still been together. And also maybe if it didn't take 3 movies to finally bring Lando into the trilogy. How many videos do you think would be on YouTube right now ranting and raving if Luke had just become the Jedi most of us thought he'd become? How would it compare to the number of videos we do have on YouTube right now complaining that he didn't become that? Then ask yourself if, from a business perspective, it was a good idea to do that to Luke. And no, that's not to say they should always play it safe with Star Wars and never try to throw fans a curveball, even one we may not exactly like being done to a character we adore. But maybe don't do it with what is essentially amounting to your first move with the franchise out of the gates. Don't immediately take chances with the most iconic characters in the history of the franchise that you are in no way, shape, or form responsible for creating. And sure, you bought them, you own them, and you can do whatever the hell you want with them in theory. I can't deny that. But if you want people, and especially the fans, to get on board with your version of Star Wars, if you want people who have loved Star Wars for decades to go and visit Galaxy's Edge and drop a small fortune to see your new characters in a brand new land, maybe first show them how much you care about and respect the original characters we all fell in love with. And look, I fully admit it's impossible to know how many fans are really leaving the franchise or don't care about it anymore. And at the same time, I also know many will point to the failure of Solo and say it was the boycott that hurt the numbers the most, when sure, that played a factor, maybe a fairly big one considering diehard fans are the type that will go a half dozen times to see a Star Wars film in the theater and bring people with them each and every time that maybe otherwise wouldn't have gone to see it. But what Solo's small box office take said to me is far more concerning for Disney and Lucasfilm. It said that the honeymoon is over, and it's time for these new movies to stand on their own merits, that the average moviegoer or more casual fan, who does make up the bulk of the audience, let's be honest here, and who turned out in droves for The Force Awakens, just didn't turn out for Solo. It said that the name Star Wars has already lost its draw, that people are already done just automatically going to see these new movies. And so we have to face the reality that the Star Wars name or brand has lost its luster with some of the general audience, and that at least some percentage of the hardcore fan base has been lost. How large that percentage is can certainly be debated, but to claim it's only a tiny, insignificant minority is to be ignorant and to ignore the fact that those fans and their money have been lost. Furthermore, The mocking, ridiculing, and name-calling of those fans by associates of Lucasfilm has all but assured that most will never return. Which then brings us to maybe the most important question of all of them, the one that will have the greatest impact on the future of the franchise. Are kids today falling in love with Star Wars? Will there be another generation of superfans created, like the originals and the prequels created? Because though maybe the prequels didn't resonate with the older fans of the time, from casual to hardcore fan, it certainly resonated with a lot of kids at the time, as did the Clone Wars animated series that followed it. And there was a curious piece of information to come out of San Diego Comic-Con from Hasbro, the company that makes Star Wars action figures. That being that they have no current plans to make any more action figures based on the animated show Resistance, which could very well mean that Season 2 will be the last for the show. After all, part of the point of pretty much any cartoon aimed at kids is to sell toys to them. And clearly, kids don't want the toys from Resistance if Hasbro is essentially canceling the line after just one wave. And it's interesting to note that the Clone Wars animated series supported a long-running toy line by Hasbro for multiple years. Rebels also saw a couple full waves of figures released before its toys more or less got integrated into the waves of figures launched with the movies. Either way, there were figures being made based off the show for its entire run. There are even several 6-inch Black Series figures from the show, a line aimed mostly at collectors, which says it wasn't just kids who watched and enjoyed Rebels. And as a Star Wars collector myself, what I find the most interesting thing of all is that 5 to 10 years ago, that time period when the only thing Star Wars going on was the Clone Wars, and of course the expanded universe, you could walk into any retail store, like a Walmart or a Target or a Toys R Us when they still existed, and see a rather large and healthy Star Wars toy section. Yet nowadays, in an age where Star Wars is supposedly in full force, and the movies are coming out, well, we're coming out once a year, you can walk into a Walmart or a Target and maybe not even find a Star Wars section. And if you do, it's tiny, a couple square feet of space at best. And what you see on the shelf now is quite literally the same stuff that was on the shelf a year ago. Now, do I think poor toy sales are proof that Star Wars isn't resonating with kids? No, it might just be proof that less kids are playing with action figures and that sort of thing in general today, which is still bad news for Star Wars because, at least for me, when I was a kid, playing with Star Wars toys was a huge part of the experience and kind of cemented my love for it. I have just as many fond memories, if not more, of getting new action figures or vehicles or playsets and then playing with them than I do actually watching the movies. And speaking of watching the movies, when I was young, the only movies I had access to, more or less, was the original Star Wars trilogy on VHS, so I watched them time and time again. Nowadays, kids can basically watch whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want. Or just as easily, they can play games on their phone or on Xbox, PlayStation, or whatever else it is, rather than play with action figures. And I'm not saying I blame kids for that. I likely would have made the same choice if I had those options at my disposal when I was young. Anyway, this makes it really hard to know just how much Star Wars is resonating or not resonating with kids today. But if I had to guess, it's something that many of them probably do enjoy, but it's just one of those things on a long list of other things or other interests that they have. And in most cases, they're probably not watching the movies over and over again or playing with the toys. It's not being ingrained into their very being like it was for me when I was a kid. In other words, young people today have so many more options and so much more entertainment at their very fingertips, and it's going to be very difficult for any one thing to grab their attention and to hold it for any length of time. It's foolish to think that just as many kids today will become big Star Wars fans from this current generation as did from the prequel generation or original trilogy generation. Even Marvel and the crazy success they're having likely isn't creating the same type of superfans that Star Wars did with previous generations. Okay, so to start to wrap this video up and to stop rambling, and to maybe draw some type of conclusion here, do I think Star Wars is dying? No, I don't, but I also don't think it's thriving. I don't think it's anywhere near what it could be right now if this whole thing had been managed far better. I think the biggest mistake made is to assume that the name Star Wars alone was all they really needed to succeed. And yeah, that name alone worked for a little while, maybe with the first few movies, but Solo was proof that people aren't going to turn out just because you call something Star Wars. Even if you use one of those legacy characters that, yeah, they are iconic and people will always know the name Han Solo in pop culture. And as I've said before, Episode 9 will be the last movie a lot of people go to just because they want to see how this all ends. But after that, if the movies aren't exceptional, if they're not good, most people are just going to stop going to them. And at best, Star Wars will be another face in the crowd. And at worst, Disney will keep randomly marching it back out there again till damn near everyone is done with it and every last cent is made off of it. Which is a real problem, one I've talked about in other videos. Star Wars is just a brand now. It's no more or no less a means by which for Disney to make money, when it started out as just one guy's crazy vision for a story and was brought to life not only by him, but by many others who maybe at first had some serious doubts, but eventually they bought into that dream and they wanted to create something special and different too. Because let's be real here, the new movies haven't been anything all that special. They don't stand out from any other blockbuster today. They're not reinventing the film industry like the original trilogy did. They're not ushering in a new age like the prequels did, helping usher in the digital age. They're just decent movies at best that maybe look a little better than some of the other big blockbusters out there today. They're movies that largely play off the nostalgia of old, yet don't truly honor the characters that got the franchise here in the first place. And no, I'm not trying to be negative, I'm just being brutally honest as I see it. Disney and Lucasfilm didn't or don't have a vision for Star Wars. That's the problem. They didn't go out looking for someone with a vision either. They went looking for people to just make them some movies. They thought the best approach would be to get 3 different people to make each of the sequel trilogy films, that each would be bringing something different and interesting to the mix. They thought they could find and hire people to manage Star Wars and to tell some stories in this universe. And people often ask me why I still have any hope for Star Wars at all. How in one breath I can say that this is wrong with it, and in the next I can say, well, I think things can get better. Well, it's because I know there are people out there who truly love and appreciate Star Wars. And if Lucasfilm would just seek these people out, and they'll come to you, Lucasfilm, or realize some are already under their nose, like a Dave Filoni, these people would bring with them a vision for the franchise again, and not treat it just as some type of job or a movie to be made. They're likely going to see it as their life work, that they'd be so honored to carry on the legacy of Star Wars that began with George Lucas, that it would mean everything to them. Again, it wouldn't just be a job. But Lucasfilm doesn't get that. They don't get that if they brought the right people in, they would make them a ton of money. Instead, they hire Benioff and Weiss from Game of Thrones to make them a trilogy, who cares so much about Star Wars that before they've even started on this trilogy, they've already lined up their next project, recently signing a $200 million agreement with Netflix to write and produce shows for them after this Star Wars trilogy they get out of the way. Which, yeah, good for them, but clearly Star Wars is just a means to an end to them. Lucasfilm also recently hired Michelle Rejwan to be Senior Vice President of Live Action Production, and in her press statement, Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm, talks about how she's good at working with writers and directors, and that's why they hired her, and doesn't even mention why she might be the right fit for Star Wars. And so to give you a final conclusion here, if you really want to know what's wrong with Star Wars today, it's that the fans who consume it love it far more than those who are making it or in charge of it. Well, that's all I've got for you this time, and if you've made it this far, thanks for watching the whole thing. Now feel free to take to the comments below and tell me what you agree with, disagree with, and what you think can be done to make sure Star Wars stays good and relevant for the years to come. Whatever it is, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.